In today's episode, guys, we're going to be talking about strength and conditioning for youth hockey players. Something I get asked about quite a bit is specifically for younger hockey players, what should they be doing? So should they be doing strength training and is it safe? What types of exercises? And what are the considerations ultimately for this kind of age group? So I'm going to be talking through a couple of key principles here around how often this should be completed, what kind of things to be focusing on, and what type of exercises and drills, that type of thing, to include on a weekly basis. So the first one is that really from the research, we'd suggest 2 to 3 times a week, youth hockey players should be doing some kind of resistance training. And resistance training covers a really broad range of terms. So just to be clear, this could just be body weight strength exercises. But it's the intensity of the movement through body weight loading which can elicit really positive changes in strength and overall adaptation. So the reason why I say 2 to 3 is because athletes of this age probably haven't accumulated enough training history yet in order to enable them to train more frequently than this. Second of all, the load parameters generally from the research are regarded as 2 to 4 sets of 8 to 15 repetitions. So this might be something like back squat, 3 sets of 12 repetitions at a load that allows that kind of rep range, which may be something like 60-65% of their current capabilities. This may also be just bodyweight movements though, so it could be something like a set of split squats, 8 repetitions per side for 3 sets. So this can cover off quite a broad range of different types. And the third principle here is about technique before load. So really the most important thing at this type of age is that hockey players focus primarily on how they're performing the movement, not necessarily what the movements are loaded in, or how the movements are loaded. So it's far more important they're done really, really well, whether that's sprinting, whether that's strength training, whether that's bodyweight movements or mobility, but just executing them to a really, really high standard is going to be an important focus for a youth hockey player overall. The fourth principle then is tissue capacity exercises as a main focus. And this is something which gets skipped quite early on in the development for a youth hockey player, but it's important that we develop these kind of key physical markers. Tissue capacity, I'll link down below to another video on this, but essentially we're talking about the ability of a muscle to withstand repeated loading. And this provides the hockey player with the ability to perform lots of volume of hockey, of which they will be asked to do a lot as they develop through different stages. And as they get older, the volume and frequency of hockey will increase, the intensity will increase. And this is a physical foundation, essentially, that allows them to remain injury-free. And the most important thing of all is that a hockey player can train frequently and can play frequently overall. That's the most important thing overall. And it's not about trying to focus on trying to get them super, super strong as quick as possible. It's about laying foundations of good quality movements and also what we call tissue capacity. 3 main areas to try and focus on. And there are others, of course, but the primary ones are around the calf and foot because of the frequency of ankle injuries, hamstring, again, just because of things like lower back injury and also just the nature of the forward flex position, putting a lot of load through the posterior chain, and also the trunk from, again, a lower back injury reduction perspective. The final ones then are focusing on fundamental movement patterns, so those things like squatting and hinging, and mobility. So fundamental movement patterns are squat, hinge, lunge, push, pull, and brace. And sometimes we're also included into that things like rotation and landing. What we're basically teaching early on is the ability of an athlete to move their body in certain patterns that are universal to a broad range of movements. The squat pattern, as an example, is found in all sorts of different sports, and it is a kind of bedrock of different sporting skills. So in hockey, squatting helps to provide a foundation for the overall ability to get into low positions in the D, for example, or track or get into effective positions when shooting or trapping, all that kind of thing. And it also enables the reduction of injury risk if an athlete can get into effective positions overall. Hinging, we mean by flexing at the hip whilst maintaining a neutral spine. And again, is really, really important for things like lower back injury and also things like getting into effective positions without putting more strain on the lower back. The final one then around mobility is important because hockey players, when they're young, need to focus on hitting really good positions. And as they grow and develop, it's quite common for hockey players to go through what's called adolescent awkwardness. And this is basically where the limbs grow faster than the tissues. And you tend to get things like reduction in coordination patterns, reduction in range of motion. And so it's important that on a consistent basis, you're including good stretching mobility routines, again, 2 to 3 times a week as a kind of general rule of thumb. This is obviously important before every training session and every match, but you can also have standalone mobility sessions included in the week as well. So overall, these are the 6 main principles. So ensuring that this is being done 2 to 3 times a week, and from a strength training perspective, 2 to 4 sets of 8 to 15 repetitions. Always focusing on the technique ahead of the load, because that provides a foundation of good quality movement early on. Tissue capacity first before looking at heavy strength training. The reason being is that the adolescent body isn't accustomed to heavy loading just yet. We've got to build the foundations and earn the right to get to that type of training. And things like high levels of tissue capacity around the calf, hamstring, trunk, also things like the adductor are really, really important in order to mitigate injury risk. Fundamental movement patterns, things like squatting and hinging. Also super important to learn these early on, because that again lays the foundation to ability to load as an older athlete once you've learned them really effectively. And if you're an older athlete who hasn't learned those movement patterns effectively, you're always going to be at a compromised position, which again may put more stress on the joints when you're loading, which may induce more injury risk. That's equally as important. And then finally, as I've already said, mobility, super important to focus on that around the hip and the thoracic spine in particular, because without that, firstly, there's increased injury risk, but secondly, you can't get into effective positions as well. So what I'll also do is link to the article I've included down below, which is specifically about youth athletes, in hockey players specifically, and also what kind of exercises to look to include and an example session in there as well. So I hope that's been useful as an overview of what a youth hockey player should be looking to focus on.